Hi there. Thank you for joining me for Understanding Alzheimer's. My name is Will Reiter, and I'm the Vice President of Outreach and Education for the Massachusetts-New Hampshire chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. And I'm here because the City of Boston is part of the Alzheimer's Workplace Alliance. And what that is, you have some information with you. There's a purple flyer that basically talks about it, but I'm going to say a few words about what the Alzheimer's Workplace Alliance is. But before I do, I'm just curious, how many of you ever wonder or worry or have concerns about your own memory? I'm just curious. Okay, so a majority of people, and I should have warned you, you're being filmed right now, so we have that for future records. So really, it's pretty common, and actually for people 50 and older, I think it's one of the most common concerns in terms of changes in memory. Because for all of us, regardless of your family history or background in terms of Alzheimer's or dementias, we start to experience changes in our memory in our 40s that are not the significant, serious changes that might be part of Alzheimer's, but certainly are things that we start noticing. And part of today's program is to talk about the 10 warning signs to help you understand what are ways that we can all try to determine if we or someone that we care about should go to a physician to get a diagnosis, not necessarily that it's Alzheimer's disease. So people are concerned about their memory. I'm curious, how many people know someone who has either had or has Alzheimer's or related dementia? So again, a lot of people. So that's pretty common too, because Alzheimer's is a growing concern, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the demographics and what's going on and why. Alzheimer's has actually been around for a long time. It was first diagnosed in 1906 by Dr. Alois Alzheimer. That's why we have that strange name that's so hard to pronounce. He diagnosed a patient due to the plaques and tangles on autopsy that he saw to make a diagnosis. So I'll talk about the cause of the disease and what we know about it. Let me go back to the Alzheimer's Workplace Alliance. So the Alzheimer's Association is the largest voluntary health organization in the world, and our primary focus is to end Alzheimer's. We believe that by grassroots movements of getting people to be proactive about the disease and advocating for funding for research to find real and effective treatments, and to encourage family members that are impacted to come together to ask for better public policy, that we can make a difference with this disease. And the Alzheimer's Workplace Alliance is a program that the association started about 5 years ago, essentially saying to civic organizations and businesses, we want you to be joining with us, to be doing education, helping us reach out to employees who might be impacted themselves, or maybe as a supervisor, someone that reports to you is impacted by this disease. So the City of Boston, we're very happy, the largest city in the US that signed the Alzheimer's Workplace Alliance, Mayor Walsh said, this is an important 21st century health crisis, and we want to make sure that our employees and their families know about Alzheimer's. So this flyer talks about some of the online supports and information that are available, as well as our helpline, which is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Next slide. So in today's program, I'm going to talk a little bit about the facts and figures. How many people currently in the US have Alzheimer's? What's going on in terms of the increase, and what do we anticipate mid-century? I'm going to talk a little bit about the financial costs of the disease. Alzheimer's and related dementias are one of the most expensive illnesses because it goes on for a long period of time, and ultimately the person with Alzheimer's needs 24-hour care and assistance either within the home or in a care setting. So you can imagine in terms of Medicare costs and Medicaid costs, it's really a driver in terms of a huge amount of financial burden on our society. There's also a burden to the family member who has someone that they're trying to provide care and support to, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to talk about what is Alzheimer's and dementia. So a lot of people have heard both words, but are kind of confused about, are they the same, are they different? Sometimes people think, well, my father was diagnosed with dementia, I'm so glad that he doesn't have Alzheimer's, when in fact, Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. So that's needs further investigation in terms of a diagnosis. So I'll clarify how Alzheimer's relates to dementia. Then I'm going to stop and take some questions about anything I've covered, and then I'll go on and talk about the Alzheimer's Association and what we provide and how we can help. So at the moment, I'm going to show you a really quick video with a lot of good information, and then there'll be a quiz right after that. So this is a short-term memory test, so pay attention. So some pretty sobering statistics. I actually heard someone gasp at one point. I don't remember when or where, but did anybody see anything that they were surprised about, or any numbers that seemed new to you? It goes by pretty quickly.
Every 68 seconds.
Every
68 seconds, that was surprising.
So actually that number about every 68 seconds, that video was made in 2013, and it's actually now every 67 seconds. So as we move forward in time, unfortunately, that number is going down, which means more and more people are being diagnosed. Anything else?
Well, I love this one about the public, the diseases that kill us, and the way they have Alzheimer's growing and everybody else shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And I seem to hear so much more about the other public health, the problems, than I do about Alzheimer's. It doesn't get nearly the press or the attention that it seems like the other diseases are getting. And it's the only one that's incurable.
Right, so I'm just gonna rephrase that in a short way, and that is that the segment about, in the top 10 leading causes of death, and frankly, sooner or later we all do pass on from something, but I personally want to have a major heart attack or stroke at like 95 late at night, and then I just go to the great beyond. That's what I've put in a request for. But we don't all get what we want when it comes to that. And we have been very, very good in the past 20 to 30 years in investing in treatments for conditions which used to be the cause of someone's demise. So a heart attack and a stroke, even AIDS. There are treatments now that help these conditions either be maintained at a chronic level or prevent a major attack. Alzheimer's disease is the only disease in the top 10 leading causes of death for which we have no cure, for which we have no treatment that actually alters the disease process. So we've probably heard about Aricept or Razidine or Memantine. These are all FDA-approved medications, but they actually just help the person function better. So they help messenger chemicals that are in the brain to fire better and transfer messages better, but those treatments don't stop the progression of the disease. So what we want more than anything is a way to stop the disease as we move forward. Another fact in the video that I think kind of really gives you a perspective. It says if every caregiver of someone with Alzheimer's lived in a single state, it would be the 5th largest state in the US, and they show, I think, Illinois and maybe Florida. So that's a lot of people. Currently, there are 5.3, 5.4 million people in the US with Alzheimer's disease. It mentioned there are about 15 million caregivers. So for every person, there's usually more than one person that's supporting and assisting them. So there's a lot of people involved in a family. You talked about, we don't really know about Alzheimer's. You know, I'm not sure there's been any major studies into why this disease is sort of a secret. Certainly it is devastating. Certainly the fact that we don't have a treatment. I'm wondering whether there's maybe a little bit of ageism involved in that, you know, the greatest risk for developing the disease for any of us is getting older. So if we look at numbers 65 and older, if you're in that group, 65 and older, about 1 out of 9 people in that group, so 65 on up, has Alzheimer's or some type of dementia. At 85 and up, it's 1 out of 3. So we all want to have a wonderful golden retirement and live independently and, you know, travel. But unfortunately for many people as we get older, the disease becomes part of what happens. We're going to go to the next slide. Next slide. So here, this graph essentially shows us the projected number of people aged 65 and older in the US who currently have Alzheimer's, and what's projected as we go here from 2015 over to 2050. And if you look at the colors, the yellow or gold segment is the population age 85 and older. So what you can see is that's the group that grows the most, but then we also have the second tier group, the purple, age 75 to 84, which is also growing. So the biggest risk and the biggest factor that impacts these numbers, as we say going towards 2050 with 13.8 million people in the US, is the fact that there's this huge cohort of all of us getting older. So the baby boomer generation, which I'm at the tail end of. I was born in 1961, so I'm bringing up the rear of this group as it ages along. Next slide. And this just repeats what we talked about earlier. Is it shows deaths from select diseases between 2000 and 2013, and that a number of conditions, there are more and more treatments for prostate cancer and heart disease and stroke that are helping prevent an attack or manage a condition, whereas with Alzheimer's disease, it's a growing number of people. Next slide. So I mentioned that Alzheimer's is expensive, and this just shows that Medicaid spends nearly 3 times as much on average on persons with dementia as for a beneficiary without dementia. And when we look at Medicaid, it's nearly 19 times as much on average for persons with dementia as for a beneficiary without dementia. People, as I said, need 24-hour care and assistance. People with Alzheimer's and dementia have more difficulty controlling their other health conditions and or their family caregivers because of their changes in cognition and ability to manage and control medications, or certainly someone who's diabetic and has Alzheimer's is going to have more difficulty managing that disease. So there's an expense if we don't do something about this disease going forward. Next slide. For family caregivers, So this is where my work mainly focuses on, and I just wanted to acknowledge that I've had Alzheimer's on both sides of my family. So my grandmother on my father's side developed Alzheimer's after she had a number of strokes, and I have an aunt that just passed away earlier this year on my mother's side who had Alzheimer's. So I know that for my family, there were a lot of challenges in getting a diagnosis. My family lives in suburban Philadelphia, so not in the greater Boston area. But for my aunt, getting her doctor to use the A word, it just seemed like she was really reluctant. And she kept saying things like, well, what do you expect in your aunt at 85? Well, I expect her to know what season it is and not to go out in the winter to rake the leaves at 10 p.m. at night. And I expect her to be able to take care of herself. So these kinds of changes were happening and the doctor wasn't really addressing them or paying attention. Also, people with Alzheimer's or dementia might have periodic outbursts or disagreements with the person that's caring for them. And that can be very upsetting for the caregiver, a person who's had a lifelong relationship with them, the spouse or partner or the son or daughter. And it's important that family members learn how to better communicate and prevent those kinds of arguments and disagreements, which is one of the things that we offer classes for family caregivers. Another challenge is families are not always in agreement. You know, sometimes the local caregiver who lives near the person with Alzheimer's is quite aware of what's going on, but the sibling who lives in California doesn't feel that there's a problem. And so there's challenges in not everyone being on the same page, and that's not that uncommon. Next slide. So we present this information because as part of an organization or a corporation, you may have employees that you supervise that are family caregivers and might be experiencing some of the challenges that I just talked about. There are quite a few people that are working and providing care. It says who is a caregiver. So 60% are women, about 66% to be exact, and 50% are employed full-time or part-time, and 26% of caregivers not only caring for a family member with Alzheimer's, but also children under the age of 18. And before I forget, I just want to mention one other thing that I haven't said yet. So the greatest risk factor for Alzheimer's is age, and it's much more common for people to develop the symptoms and be diagnosed at 65 and older. But there are people that develop Alzheimer's earlier than that. So people that start experiencing the symptoms in their 50s and even 40s, but it's much rarer. So if we talk about 5.4 million people in the US with Alzheimer's currently, there are about 200,000 people in the US who have what we call younger onset. So the symptoms have started before 65. Most of those people are, in the 60 to 65 range, but there are individuals that develop it earlier, and it's usually a much more rare form. When I talk about genetics, I'll talk about that a little bit more. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about Alzheimer's and dementia and give a clearer perspective on what is this disease and what are the warning signs. Next slide. So I asked you when we started how many of you noticed changes in your own memory. And I wonder what kinds of things you've experienced. I'll tell you the kind of things that I experience, which is, we call it sort of the tip of the tongue syndrome, where you're talking with a friend about a book that you've read or a movie that you saw, and you can't remember the name of the author, you can't remember the name of the actor, you can't remember the name of the title of the film. You're talking about it in the moment, it's kind of stuck somewhere, and then 5 minutes later you go back to your office and boom, it comes up. The movie that you saw had Meryl Streep in it, and then you figure it out. So that kind of thing where things get stuck, but then you find them later, much more common in 40s, 50s, and older. The good news is, usually you remember those things, so that means that your hippocampus, which is the filing cabinet of the brain, is still working. It's just maybe something else, like How many of you ever feel stress at work? Do you ever feel like you're stressed out? Nobody. Everyone's just shaking their head. Okay, so stress easily impacts memory, or if you don't get enough sleep, or if you're a little bit under the weather, that can impact that kind of a system. Another thing that's harder for us as we get older is to do several things at once. I've always considered myself a pretty good multitasker. Like, I have multiple projects and I can keep track of what I need to do now and what I need to do in an hour. I found that I need to rely more on, writing a list, following a system, that I can't just rely on myself to remember what to do when. But these kinds of changes are not as severe as the warning signs of Alzheimer's. So next slide. So we've given you a brochure that kind of walks you through this. I'm going to go through them quickly. You can go ahead and read this information. We also have a lot of good information at our website. And once again, we call these the warning signs, but they're not necessarily the warning signs that the person has Alzheimer's, but that they should go and see their physician to get a diagnosis. So the first warning sign, number 1, is memory loss that disrupts daily life. And that can be highlighted most specifically in a person who seems to forget something that happened completely, not just a detail, not a bit of a conversation, but family members often notice the person that they're concerned about, ask them a question, and they go off maybe to watch TV, and 35 minutes later they come back into the kitchen and they ask the same question again. When's my doctor's appointment? And the caregiver or the family member tells them it's this Friday at 10 a.m. They go off, they seem satisfied. Next thing you know, they come back and they ask the same question. This time they're more emphatic. You got to remind me about my doctor's appointment. If you don't help me, I'm going to forget about it. So they ask the same thing. They forget that the conversation ever happened. That's a warning sign that things are not going into short-term memory. So that would be a very good reason to go and get a diagnosis. 2 is challenges in planning or solving problems. So, when you balance a checkbook, there are multiple steps involved. There's mathematical figuring that goes on. You have to do things in a certain order. That would be the kind of activity where a person who used to be able to do that is having trouble with it now. That would be a warning sign that maybe something's going on. Difficulty completing familiar tasks. So when a person has trouble doing something with multiple steps, that they're not remembering the order of those steps, they're not remembering what comes after step 1 and step 2 and step 3, that would be an example of the kind of problem that a person might be showing that has the warning signs of Alzheimer's or dementia. Confusion with time or place is number 4. And so it doesn't mean that maybe you don't remember exactly what the date is, because that's frankly hard, especially if you go off on a vacation, you're not paying attention, you might not remember today's date is. But this is the kind of confusion where the person forgets what year it is, or they forget what season it is, or they forget where they are. That kind of confusion would be a warning sign. Number 5 is trouble understanding visual and spatial relationships. Often, what happens over time is the deterioration in the brain caused by Alzheimer's impacts the segments of the brain that relate to visual perception, understanding what you see, misinterpreting what you see is much more common. So that would be an example of warning sign number 5. Number 6 is new problems with speaking, writing, or reading. So sometimes family members will notice that the person is starting to talk a lot slower. They need more time to process a response or to be part of an engaging conversation. It's kind of halting conversation. That would be something that people would notice. 7, misplacing things and losing the ability to retrace steps. So I am notorious for losing things, especially important things like tax forms or reports, or so it's not necessarily occasionally misplacing something, but families will notice things in totally nonsensical places. So a person's glasses will be in the freezer, or a person's false teeth will be in the garage, or the keys will be under the bed. So putting things in places that don't make any sense is one of the things that families will sometimes experience. Number 8 is decreased or poor judgment. I'm going to hold off on that one. Number 9 is withdrawal from work or social activities. So the person that is experiencing these issues or challenges, they may not have insight or understand what's going on, but they may feel a sense of general anxiety. So sometimes people that are going through these warning signs withdraw, and they stop going to church, they stop going to the senior center. A person might stay in their office and not come out unless they have to come out. That might be an example, although some of us might do that anyway without being a warning sign. But in this instance, that is a warning sign. Number 10, changes in mood or personality. So family members may notice that the person is much more easily agitated or anxious or upset, or sometimes even that they're much more carefree. They don't seem as concerned about things as they used to be. Any change in personality might be related to this illness. And number 8, decreased or poor judgment. So that depends on the person and their baseline and what they've always been like in their life. So if the person always made bad decisions about their career or their spouse or their use of alcohol, that's their baseline. If someone has always been really good at saving money and only spending it on the necessities, and now late in life, they're buying a lot of things they don't need, like multiple small appliances, and storing them in a guest room, that would be sort of a change in their behavior that would seem unusual. And in the mix of things, might say, let's figure out what's going on. So any questions or comments about the 10 warning signs? Has anyone ever seen these in someone that they've been concerned about? Yes, yes. Which is the one that you've noticed? All of them, okay. So the symptoms, to be clear in terms of getting a diagnosis, usually a family member would not see them all at once. Usually when it starts, the person would notice the memory loss challenges, like the repeated questions or forgetting that yesterday their daughter visited, and then one of the other challenges. These symptoms become more apparent and more present for all people with Alzheimer's as they move along the continuum to a diagnosis. Yes?
All your studies and all of this seems to be about U.S. Do we know what's going on globally? Like, do other countries have this same type of high rate? Or?
So I'm going to repeat the question a little bit. So the question was, what do we know internationally and what's going on around the world? Alzheimer's is an international health crisis. It's certainly noted and researched and statistically, demographically collected in those countries that have those kinds of systems in place. And since it's age-related, certainly those countries that are living longer are the ones where we're seeing a higher percentage, but a similar increase in terms of the U.S. So it is going on around the globe. There are some ethnicity-related risk factors, and I actually am going to speak about these just in relation to research in the U.S., but for a person who's Latino, they're at 1.5 times greater risk than the Caucasian population, and for an African American, there's a 2 times greater risk than the Caucasian population, and those issues seem to be primarily related to some of the cardiovascular health issues that are also higher in those communities. So high blood pressure, high cholesterol, Diabetes seems to have a relationship. It's not causative, but it seems to come into play in the complex array of things that can increase somebody's risk. We need more research into the different risk factors, but that certainly is true. Okay. Any other comments or questions about the 10 warning signs? We're going to move on then to Alzheimer's and dementia. So I mentioned confusion around dementia and what is it. So dementia is not in and of itself a specific disease diagnosis. It's kind of a diagnostic syndrome. Physicians use the word dementia when a person is experiencing some of those warning signs that we've already just talked about. Underneath that umbrella term of dementia are some things that are treatable, and then other diseases which are currently not treatable, Alzheimer's disease being the biggest irreversible, not treatable dementia. Alzheimer's disease accounts for about 60 to 80% of dementias, but there are other illnesses called vascular dementia, which is somewhat different than Alzheimer's. Vascular dementia is caused by a blockage in the brain or series of mini strokes or stroke activity, but not everyone that has a stroke or mini strokes necessarily develops vascular dementia, but it can be the result of that kind of brain activity. Lewy body dementia is caused by Lewy bodies, which is another type of brain anomaly. And Lewy body dementia in the early stages looks more like Parkinson's because it has some of the physical manifestations of Parkinson's, such as the tremoring or the stiffness. And frontotemporal dementia, which starts in the frontal lobe and the temporal lobes of the brain, and actually early in the disease can look very different from Alzheimer's. So it's more behavioral and less related to memory and thinking problems. Treatable dementias. So what are we talking about? So a brain tumor can cause dementia symptoms, changes in cognition, changes in memory, changes in function, but a brain tumor in some instances can ultimately be treated and the person hopefully returns to normal function. Hydrocephalus, which is a collection of fluid on the brain, can cause dementia, and that can be treated one way by shunting to release the pressure. It also then often helps the person return to a previous level of function. So Alzheimer's disease is currently irreversible, it's progressive, it destroys brain cells. So in a moment you'll see a slide, a brain scan, where the plaques and tangles, which are the hallmarks of Alzheimer's, form in the brain, cause the brain neurons or brain cells to die over time, and it changes the mass of the brain, it changes it impacts very seriously some important parts of the brain, and that's what causes the ongoing deterioration and destruction. Next slide. So this is a scan of a normal brain. You'll see the neurons. We have about 100 billion brain cells, and then in between those 100 billion brain cells, we have these things called synapses or tendrils, across which the messages, the electrical messages fire and communicate in the brain. What happens is amyloid precursor protein, which is a naturally occurring protein in the brain. We don't actually know what it does, but what happens is it gets cut, it gets cleaved twice, and in some instances, on the second cleaving, they malform and they collect to form these amyloid plaques in between the brain cells. And the other major culprit that we understand are tau that once again occur in the brain naturally. Tau occurs within the brain cell, and it's actually part of what creates the structure of the brain cell. And the tau protein, something happens to the structure of that protein, it collapses, and it creates tangles, neurofibrillary tangles, which actually occur in the brain cell. And so from within and without, there's this destructive process on the brain. Next slide. And then what happens is on this side, you can see a brain scan of someone who passed away from advanced Alzheimer's versus a healthy brain. So what looks different? So it's smaller, it's shrunken. It's actually less in weight. A healthy brain, if we opened up the top of my skull, hopefully I have a healthy brain, it would be about 3 pounds. For someone with Alzheimer's, it can deteriorate down to as little as 1 pound. So there's a lot of loss in terms of the brain mass. And then you can also see that some of these ventricles have increased. Because of the loss of brain mass and brain matter, these open areas become larger. And then this is actually that thing I mentioned called the hippocampus, which is the filing cabinet, the part of the brain that's so important for storing new memories. It's gone. It's kind of disappeared, which is why people have so much trouble remembering something that they've just been told or something that they've just experienced. So next slide. So I'm going to take another break for a minute and see if anybody has questions about Alzheimer's or dementia. Anybody want to ask anything now? Yes.
So the dementias, there were 4 of them before it could possibly get to Alzheimer's, and it seemed like it had to do with the plaque. So is there not something that we can do to prevent that buildup of the plaque, or we just don't know enough to?
Well, that is our hope. So the question was, can't we do something to prevent the buildup of the plaque and the tangles? So that's what a lot of research is, for years, has been taking place. But in fact, just a year ago, the federal government funded the first US-funded prevention study, and it's recruiting subjects here in Boston and internationally. So they're recruiting subjects in Canada and Australia. And it's actually looking at people who do not yet have the diagnosable symptoms of Alzheimer's, but on a brain scan show through a dye, a PIB scan dye, show the beta amyloid collection in terms of being abnormal. And those individuals who are entering into this study are then being treated, half of them are being treated with a drug to try to prevent the buildup of the Alzheimer's plaque and also slow it down. So that is one of the approaches to hopefully prevent people from ultimately developing symptoms. Yes?
Is Alzheimer's come on by a traumatic event? Something that happens in life and death or something like that?
So, not always, but certainly we do know that families sometimes experience, like a person is hospitalized and they seem to have been functioning okay, and they get into a acute care setting, or they have another illness, and the disease seems to emerge, and the person doesn't return to the previous function. There's a lot of thoughts on why that may be. Was the disease there all along, and it's just that the person in this new unknown setting, people are noticing it and it kind of emerges? Or if, in fact, there's something about the disease process, the person has pneumonia or some other illness that really kicks the disease into high gear. In terms of earlier, I don't know if you were asking about trauma earlier in a person's life, there hasn't been enough research or anything conclusive about that. I mean,
personal story. We went through as a family a death in the family. My brother died. My mother basically withdrew from there. It just seemed like she was totally depressed, and that seemed to just start a steady decline. I don't know if it was already there or she just withdrew from life, stopped cooking, stopped the social aspect of her life, and that seemed to be where it started.
So In terms of the research that I talked about where we're looking at people pre-symptoms, so asymptomatic Alzheimer's, what we're also able to see through those kinds of studies is that Alzheimer's really starts years and years before the symptoms are expressed. So this buildup of beta amyloid plaque and tau tangles, that starts escalating 5 to 10 years before a person starts showing symptoms. Doesn't mean that some other crisis might escalate that process, but it wouldn't suggest that sort of traumatic experience at 75 is what initiates the disease. Okay? Yes?
Once diagnosed, what's the lifespan for someone who has been diagnosed? Is there an average lifespan?
So there is an average, and I'll say it in a minute, but before I do, I just want to say, so another challenge with the disease is some people never get diagnosed, and many people get diagnosed relatively late in the disease process. So a person's lifespan from diagnosis in some ways depends on how early is it identified. But in terms of just doing an average, people that are diagnosed live on average 6 to 8 years, but people can live 15 to 20 years once they've had a diagnosis, and there is a great deal of variability in terms of individual progression with the disease. So that's another component of an area that needs to be researched further, which is why do some people progress so slowly while other people progress so quickly? If we knew why people progress slowly, we might be able to use a treatment that slows it down from that perspective. Yes?
Has there been any research on if it's hereditary?
Okay, so I'll talk about heredity and what we know about it. So once again, the biggest risk factor is age. And then in terms of what we know about heredity, if you have a parent or a sibling that has Alzheimer's, it does increase your individual risk. But that's similar to if you have a parent that's had a stroke or, so it's not like a 50% increase. It's just, it's into your mix of complicated factors. In terms of what we can see when someone has a genetic test, so I don't know if any of you saw Still Alice, the movie about younger onset Alzheimer's. So she had a deterministic gene where she went in and got a test and they said, you have Alzheimer's and we can see that genetically. And then her children had the test as well. So that kind of deterministic Alzheimer's is very, very rare. In terms of like the 100% of people that develop Alzheimer's, it's less than 1%. And it often is younger onset, and in that instance, it tends to run in families. So like siblings all develop it before 65. For most of us, though, if we had a genetic test, it would not show a yes or no answer. It might show we have a greater risk or a lesser risk. So there are risk-related genes, but it's not going to be an on or off switch. So right now, our recommendation, unless there's a younger onset family history, is not that necessarily going and get a genetic test is going to be that helpful, because it'll only say that you're more likely or less likely, but there's no way of knowing what you might happen down the road. So, yes?
I have a two-part question. First, does dementia turn into Alzheimer's? And two, with your experience with dementia patients, have you heard anything about sleepwalking or talking during the night when they sleep, talking in their sleep?
Okay, so I'll repeat the question. One was, does dementia turn into Alzheimer's? Let me start with that one. So Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. So when someone is diagnosed with dementia, we encourage folks to get a more conclusive diagnosis. Like, what is the dementia caused by? Is it Alzheimer's? Is it, sometimes people with Parkinson's develop dementia, not everyone. It is true that, like with vascular dementia, which is a type of dementia, that that person is at greater risk to develop Alzheimer's, unfortunately. So there can be something called, confusingly, mixed dementia, which is vascular and Alzheimer's together, and the symptoms occur over time and pretty much look more and more like Alzheimer's. So dementia doesn't always turn into Alzheimer's. It depends what's causing it. And then your second question was about sleep and whether people with Alzheimer's experience either sleepwalking or are more likely to talk or speak.
Like you're keeping a conversation
Yeah.
while you sleep.
So, interestingly, I haven't heard anything about that, but I can say that Alzheimer's does impact the individual's ability to sleep. I mean, people tend to get up more, they wake up more often, they're more restless during sleep, and I'm sure that that would make it more likely that a person, I have a propensity to have dreams where I'll start talking and kicking, so you don't want to be next to me at night, you might get a foot to your backside. So that kind of activity would probably increase with Alzheimer's, but I haven't heard about necessarily a large study around that. So, okay, any other questions or comments? Yes.
So it sounds to me like basically we're driving a car, we're looking in the rearview mirror, because you have to go back and see what patterns and things were in order to kind of get an idea on when this might have happened and how this might have happened. Is that?
Well, that's certainly true in terms of research, but I think as a family member, it's just as helpful to look at the person now. And so how do we diagnose Alzheimer's? So a person should be getting to their primary care physician or a diagnostic center or a neurologist to have a comprehensive medical exam, which would include some kind of memory test, some kind of history where the person and especially their care partner or family member is talking about, 2 years ago I started noticing this. Because one of the other ways that a physician would diagnose Alzheimer's versus the treatable causes of dementia is the slow onset. So a person that has other types of dementia, usually the onset is quicker, whereas with Alzheimer's, it's much slower in terms of the change. So the history, a memory test, a neurological exam, preferably some kind of brain scan to see if there's been a stroke or other kind of brain activity. A blood test might be involved in terms of checking medications and different other things related to function. And then from that, a physician can make an assessment, rule out treatable causes, and come up with a diagnosis.
I think it's hard though when you're the person on the outside, when they're covering for one another, like elderly parents. So you really have no idea because you don't live with them, you go there, you see certain things, or you're kind of concerned, you talk to the other one and they're like, oh, you're making a big deal out of it. So it's really hard as a family member to know how to support some of that because they're not being truthful either.
So you're right, I'll repeat a little bit of what you said. So it's true that if there's a couple, an older couple, that often the well spouse or the spouse that doesn't have the memory problems but may have their own health concerns is less likely to, one, acknowledge the memory problems and necessarily want to investigate them. There's a little bit of, I'm taking care of things, don't worry about it, I'm the wife, I'm the husband. I think, and it's something to talk about with someone at our helpline in terms of how do you manage that kind of situation. Certainly, you may have to wait until something happens in terms of preferably something that's not life-threatening, but an incident where a family member, a son or daughter can step in and say, Mom, let's look at this. Dad is having a lot of problems. Maybe talking with the physician separately, at least to provide some information. Ultimately, that spouse or partner does have primary responsibility for that other person, so trying to align yourself with them and maybe getting other family members to be on the same page is one way to kind of go about it and move forward. But I'm happy to talk with you afterward about that situation a little bit more specifically. Yes?
Some people with dementia get violent. With the medication to, how should I say?
To help prevent that from happening?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is true that, as I mentioned, personality problems and changes being part of the disease process. Sometimes people can get agitated who normally would have been very calm, very agreeable. Certainly when the first time something like that happens, the family member should talk with a physician, because sometimes it can be caused by a physical problem, like maybe a urinary tract infection or some kind of other illness that might be the impetus or catalyst for that problem. Sometimes it might be the caregiver learning new ways to communicate and helping the person. I know that in my own experience, I worked in an adult daycare setting and sort of learned to help someone in a very patient, slow, supportive way. So sometimes caregivers can learn new ways to introduce activities or participate in care that can prevent arguments or disagreements. So that's another way to go. It's also true that sometimes people with Alzheimer's are clinically depressed, and that can be why they're getting agitated and angry and upset and pushing someone or acting out. So that would be something for the physician to investigate. And there are also treatments that can be prescribed to help the person be calmer. The important thing is to just make sure that the person isn't over-medicated so that they're stumbling or might have a fall. So I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Well, we've only got 4 minutes left.
Okay, next slide. Okay, just want to tell you a little bit about the Alzheimer's Association. So we're a national organization. We have a free 24-hour helpline where people can call us to kind of talk about the same issues or questions that you might be bringing up here. There are counselors that can, that know about the disease, that know about strategies and approaches to kind of help solve problems. We can send you information about behaviors and how to intervene, activities. We also provide education programs which you can access and find out more about through our website. And we also help to provide support groups. So I think, Chi, did you want to say anything about?
I do. My name is Patricia McCormick, and I am I'm the Alzheimer's Initiative for the City of Boston. It's a very, very important initiative to Mayor Walsh. His family went through it, and it was devastating for his family because of the lack of support. So when I came here in January, I thought, oh, I'm going to be, creating resources. City of Boston employees, I want you to know an enormous amount of resources already exist within the city. I have only been here for 3 months. There's so much inside of City Hall. In our back row, we have Giselle Sterling. She's our new Commissioner of Veterans. The Veterans has 4 people, office has 4 people who will help City of Boston employees and their families walk through this support that's available through the Veterans Department, which is not available through any place else. I mean, they're a fantastic resource. Over here we have Carol Donovan, who is in charge of FMLA within City Hall. They are also fabulous. If you have a diagnosis, if someone in your family has a diagnosis, they can help walk you through the process. They can help you get help. In the back row, we have Wendy Cook and Diane, who are City of Boston EAP. You'll see in the resource guide that I gave you, I thought our EAP was for drugs and alcohol. As Joe Cullinan, the director, says, 85% of the people who contact the EAP do so because of stress. We describe stress as too many demands and not enough resources. They will walk you through the process. There are also the elderly department, Shannon Murphy in the back, is the head of the advocates. We have 8 advocates, 1 for each neighborhood in the city. They will point you in the right direction. They will tell you about 1 million resources that you didn't know exist. They will come and visit you. They will do whatever they can to help. It's amazing to me, and I didn't know it until I went to work in the elderly department, how many resources are available. What I did find since the first year of the mayor's initiative is about City of Boston employees. We're going to expand out into all of the citizens of Boston after that. It is, I mean, it's so important to know that these resources exist, because when, as you were saying, so many questions come up, and it's like, where am I going to, who would I ask, where am I going to get help? Well, the Alzheimer's Association is a huge resource. And what I have done in the packets that I did for you guys today to take home is I assume there are going to be a lot. I'm 64. I'm going to be assuming that there's packets are going to be handed to people who are not computer literate, who do not know how to go online. I've tried to say what I thought the most important and most helpful resources are. There's an organization, Boston Elder Info. They're funded by state and federal and city funds. These people will also come to your, you call them, they will find you people to come to your home and create a care plan that you can all agree on. They'll help you, walk you through the steps. I just want to stress, and I hope everybody grabs the packet, that there is enormous amount, oh, I'm sorry, and Chris is here from the Disabilities Department. Early onset Alzheimer's is now, it's now a disabilities diagnosis. They can help you as well. There's so much help in-house that I want everybody to grab one of these and take it, because it is so important to know that help is in hand. But the hardest thing I found working in the city of Boston is we don't seem to know about each other. You know, we don't seem to know that the help is available. So my edict is to make sure people know that there's help out there, and that the help out there knows about the other help out there. So if they can't help you, they can refer you to somebody who can. My name is, and phone number, all my contact information is on all of this stuff. This is my job. I would love to hear from anybody and direct you, help you in any way that I can, okay? All right.
So thank you for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully got some helpful information, and you've got resources to contact going forward. So have a good afternoon. Thank you.